The following podcast is a little fiery but mostly peaceful. If you're an automaton, turn away now and shelter in place. If you're a Catholic ready to renew your prescriptions of red pills and white pills, stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Catholics Aren't Zombies. I'm your host, Chris Munir. Thank you for joining and tuning in. Catholics must become economically literate. Oh boy, we have a tough topic today. And anybody who heard my last podcast, if you paid attention at the beginning, you may have noticed that I intended to do this one at about the time I recorded the last one. I kind of postponed it because I got a little distracted. And also, I have to say, with this particular topic, economics, and the fact that Catholics are not really doing too terribly well with it in recent years, it's one of those topics that, boy, you could attack it from 100 different angles. And, that's what I was debating with myself. Do I make a brief podcast economics lesson? Do I go through how, the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church's history with economics and how it's basically created it and promulgated it and passed it down through the centuries, and how it's, basically been co-opted by secular forces and kind of messed up a little bit, morphed into a little bit of a Frankenstein? There's so many ways to approach this. One thing is certain, though, that we are in a situation these days where we are not up to snuff with economics, and it has some very serious consequences. Before I say that, I know that a lot of you are probably familiar with good old Bernie Sanders. And Sanders, the socialist, who most of us, anybody who's listening, ought to know just how wretchedly stupid his views of the world are. He's put up as perhaps the paragon of economically illiterate. The guy just, you could show him a supply-demand curve and his eyes would glaze over. He doesn't get the basics. And there's another spot I wouldn't even know where to start. But we have to be honest about something, folks. We as Catholics, not all, but most, to do that Jesse Lee Peterson thing, not all but most Catholics are not a whole heck of a lot better than Bernie Sanders. If we're like a foot or maybe 5 inches better than him, further ahead towards the goal of understanding the topic at all, that's putting it nicely. And that's also absolutely pathetic. I think this is one of those topics where we also fall into that purity spiraling problem. You've heard people like Tim Gordon use that term. It's where Catholics, and maybe even mostly traditional Catholics, tend to think that they're too good for something, and that, they're holier than thou. And I think this could be the case with economics, is that, we're beyond that. That's all materialistic. That's all, daily grind, rat race sort of stuff. I'm the kind of person that only dedicates my time and effort towards the spiritual life, and everything else is just dreaded and awful, and it's the dismal science. You should want nothing to do with economics. That's what I get the sense of. I think this is pretentious, and I think this is foolhardy. Because let's face it, unless you are a cloistered nun or a monk, and even then you don't completely get away from it, your life is contingent upon at least a certain degree of economic knowledge, economic wisdom. And I was almost tempted to say that monks and nuns have no use for it. But then again, I'm reminded of where I get my coffee from. The best coffee I can think of comes from the Carmelite monks in Wyoming. Not because they're slaving away at any rat race, but because economics is ultimately the material way of serving one another. And this is a good thing. These are the fruits of our labor, which, yes, from going back to Genesis, that's our punishment, to toil the fields with the sweat of our brow and all that. But there is good that comes from that if we do it right. That's what economics is. Or let me give you a quick definition. Economics is the production, exchange, and consumption of goods. And notice I did not use the word distribute in there anywhere. That was an addition of the Marxists, the communists, and also our friends, the distributists, which I ought to tell you, that's the kind of company they all have. I'll come back to that later. But it's the production, exchange, and consumption of scarce resources. I should have put that in there first, too. Scarce resources. Without scarcity, if something's infinite, you really kind of don't really have to worry about it that much unless for some reason you can't obtain it, but which then, of course, it would be scarce. So emphasis on scarcity. And the reason this is important and that it matters is because even for the most ascetic, hardcore, anti-materialist person on the planet, you encounter things in life that you want on a material level, and you will encounter the scarcity problem. So it helps to have some idea how things work. All right, I don't want to get super duper deep and epistemological and all that on this, so I'm going to kind of just leave you with that. That's the basis of economics. Now, as we know from the gospel, that we are commanded to seek first the kingdom of God, which is obviously a spiritual good. And we know that where our treasure is, what we consider our treasure, indicates where our heart lies. This is a commandment and exhortation to focus on the spiritual life first and foremost, to not allow mammon or the material stuff or all the scarcity of goods out there to dominate us and supersede our commitment to the spiritual life. So we need to have that grounding, or we're going to get really messed up really quickly. So when we keep that in mind, what do we do with the material stuff? And that's where economics comes in. Economic wisdom is a way of allowing us to manage and effectively steward scarce goods so that we don't screw them up so badly and we run around with it like a chicken with a head chopped off, trying to salvage and reclaim goods as fast as we can. If we have economic wisdom, we don't become a slave to the paper. We don't become a slave to the obtaining of economic goods. I know this is a little dense, a little more esoteric than what I normally cover. Economics helps us deal in the most efficient and painless way possible with the acquisition, management, and consumption of goods so that we don't go broke and end up a slave to some, surreptitious tyrant that walks along. And that is always what happens. And that's what's happening now, and it's what's with the highway to hell that we've been on in recent decades in Western civilization. Because if you get economics wrong and you go full commie, as they like to say, well, guess what? You're not going to be able to do much in terms of the spiritual life, because you might end up in a gulag or something. You might end up in a factory at gunpoint. You might end up in a concentration camp or a prison. That's the extreme end of things. Or you may end up with, just like we've had recently, you may be in debt up to your eyeballs. You may be contingent upon the government, like I said, surreptitious tyrant, for all of your material needs, which means you're going to be beholden to their terms on things. And this is, my friends, the ultimate tragedy of not getting economics. If you don't get it one way or the other, you're going to be beholden to the state. If you can't balance your dang checkbook, you're going to be beholden to the state at one point or another. Maybe you're dependent on them for your employment. Maybe you're dependent on them for food stamps. Maybe you're dependent on them, for tax breaks or just any number of things. Maybe you're in an industry where if they don't hook you up, like farming's become a disaster. That's old news at this point. Not a lot of people really pay attention to it. But if you're a farmer, you're beholden to the government the way things work. It's not a surprise at all that our food's as bad as it is. We've got fascist, corporatist, governmented food, basically, because the private interests caved into the state. First, they, insisted the state being such an influential force on food. Then they got surprised that the state took over. Now, any farmer out there will tell you they can't do squat unless they get their precious subsidies. They got to have their special favors. Deep down, I don't think they like that, but they get it that way because that's just the only means of survival at this point. Do you see how that works? Again, there's a truckload of details. I didn't draw out a whole lot of really specific examples, so I'll apologize on that. Maybe if we sat down and handled this face-to-face, I could give you really good concrete examples. But as I say, we as Catholics, even the most, contemplative types who don't want nothing to do with the world, and I don't blame you. This is not me, castigating you for completely wanting to avert materialism. Materialism does suck. And we put up with it, for several decades, during this life of ours. and this valley of tears, we put up with this problem, dealing with the scarcity of resources, with the hope of an eternal existence where we never have to worry about it again. The flame consumeth not, the moth consumeth not. You know how it is in the gospel. I'm probably misquoting it slightly. I could also talk about the various economic schools of thought. They're related to what's called macroeconomics. And this always comes down to how we're going to run our society in terms of all the economic aspects. Fiscal policy and monetary policy. Those are the two big ones. How you handle taxes, fiscal policy, and then how you handle the money supply, monetary policy. Several different schools of thought. Most of them are rotten because, again, the Catholic Church figured out the right ways to understand economics way back with the scholastics. I think even the Jesuits. We had this figured out, and guess what? Yes, it is free market. It is free market economics. We've since come to know it as capitalism, and we've given it all these, funny derogatory names to make it something that it's not. But basically, it is the voluntary production, exchange, and consumption of goods. When you start playing games with that, you start playing games with these funny little theories, Keynesianism, Marxism, distributism, all these other funny little economic schools of thought that require the use of force, that require a king. 1 Samuel chapter 8 should have told us we don't want the king. The king always makes us miserable. But when we go with these bizarre, awful, totalitarian schools of thought, economic schools of thought, all that is us wandering into the territory of wanting a king to manage our resources because we're not adults. We can't handle it. The more to the fact we can't trust God. It doesn't mean you have no personal stewardship of your resources. Quite the contrary. God is calling upon us to be good stewards of all of our material resources. But when we farm that out to the state, when we farm that out to some kind of king or president or Congress, and then they go and employ these silly economic theories like Keynesianism, Marxism, even the Chicago School, all of these ones that use central economic planning, Federal Reserve, lots of tax policy, lots of progressive income tax. That's basically one of two things. Us admitting that we are not adults and we can't handle it, and that we don't trust God and his divine providence for all of it. That's ultimately what it is. Now, I'm probably going to get some flack from some of the traditional Catholics, of which I'm actually sympathetic. I kind of consider myself a traditional Catholic. But the concept of adhering to the traditions of the faith is a very good thing. So insofar as that's what the term means, fine. I'm happy to say I am a traditional Catholic. I don't, by the way, think that certain bishops of the internet necessarily are. Hint, hint. But, in terms of real legitimate tradition, yes, I'm fully on board with that. But there is this weird movement within traditional Catholicism. I don't know if you'd call it a movement. There's just some of them that adhere to this idea of distributism. And the biggest problem with it, aside from the fact that, like I said, there's really nothing about economics that lends itself, through the natural law to this concept of distributing goods. Only when you introduce a tyrant with the use of aggressive force, i.e. the violation of the seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal, only when you do that is there ever the possibility of all this quote-unquote distributing. Now the Marxists, including the Fabian Socialists and all the other ugly variants of Marxism, just communism, I would just call it what it is, well, they're known for it. They are unabashedly clear on what they want to do about it. If you pay enough attention, we act like we're surprised, when they're not really socialism with a happy face on it, social democracy, that sort of thing. We're always kind of surprised for some reason when things get ugly. But if you look really closely, they're very, very upfront about it. Karl Marx was upfront about it. Saul Alinsky was pretty upfront about things. Those are the folks who are champions of the concept of distributism. Now, I understand that the Catholic distributists, the ones that call themselves that, and they get it from G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, two writers from the early 20th century. They don't share all the crazy, evil, anti-family aspects of the Marxists and communists, but they are very much in league with the idea of confiscation of resources for the redistribution to Catholic families. Now, there's certain sentiments of that seem appealing. Okay, yeah, I'm a big family guy. Absolutely. Let's empower families, especially Catholic ones. I can see where people think this is our way out of a lot of our problems, because in many ways it is. But their means of getting there are evil. Confiscation and redistribution of goods is evil. It is a violation of the seventh commandment. Moreover, the biggest problem of them all is that they're never clear at all who would actually do the distributing. And as soon as they suggest somebody that would, go and do all the confiscation, which you have to do first, do all that confiscation and then redistributing, as soon as they suggest anybody, you're immediately left to wonder why that's so-and-so who would be doing the confiscating and redistributing would have the legitimate right to do so. Oh, it's going to be, Robin Hood. He's going to... Give me a break, okay? A, that never happened, so this is all a pipe dream anyway. But no matter which way you slice it, it's evil. We can't stoop to the level of communists. All of their blatant disregard for the fifth, the seventh, and also the eighth commandment. They butcher them to shreds. We can't stoop to that level. Two wrongs don't make a right. Cannot do evil that good may come of it. It's not how it works. So, let me try to sum this up before this gets way too long and way too crazy. I think this may be a two-part topic. I may have to come back to this and do Catholic Economics Part 2. Because like I said, there's a billion different angles to cover. But hopefully this is a good little macro primer to what the problems are. I mean, we can see it, guys. Really big takeaway from this is that we have failed to understand economics as Catholics. We've acted like we're too good for it. And so our enemies, who do not have anybody's best intentions in mind, have taken advantage of that, and they have manipulated not only our social and political systems, but including our economic and financial ones. We are a disaster. If you're listening to this from America, the United States, you live in a country that has $30 trillion of public debt now. We're pretty close. I think maybe we should pay attention to that. And one last thing, this may deserve its own episode. I've written about it and I talked about it in my book. When you screw up economics, you basically set up a near occasion of sin, or maybe even an involuntary occasion of sin, for abortion, for thievery, for all sorts of evil. Because if you screw up economics, you screw up the world so bad, people are going to get desperate, as they have. They tend to do this. And they're going to commit some of these really awful evils. When you survey people, when you survey the women, when they're asked why they would get their abortions that they get, hopefully at some point or another they regret it, they lament it, they didn't really want to do it, they weren't enthusiastic about it. But a lot of them, I think roughly half of them, cite financial and economic concerns as one of the driving forces behind that decision. You're left to wonder, okay, if we didn't have not only this society where there's tons of single moms out there, but not only that, but so much of this ridiculous scarcity of resources, even though there's plenty of wealth out there, through central economic planning, we have confiscated it from middle and lower class people like crazy, through evil progressive taxation, through evil central banking, which is a regressive tax, through evil property taxes, and there's nothing left for anybody. Unless, of course, you go and work for a company that you compromise your entire immortal soul. So again, take away from that, if you get economics wrong, and if you refuse to learn it because you think you're better than it, you think that it's not worth anybody's time, that we ought to just spend time praying the rosary and never think of anything. I pray the rosary all the time. I tell people, pray, go to Eucharistic adoration, go to Mass, but I still have time to do other stuff. We are called to be good stewards of resources. That means understanding economics. And I think at some point we will reach, if we haven't already, a precipice where our lack of concern for the topic could become very grave. And I'm going to leave it at that. Hope you enjoyed the show. I know it's a little bit more of a difficult topic. Doesn't perfectly resonate with everybody. It's okay. I know everybody's got different levels of training and understanding on that. That's part of our problem, is that the schools don't teach it. Hopefully you got a little bit out of this. It's a little bit long-winded, but it kind of has to be. Might come back at this again later. If you'd like to learn more, I would encourage you to go to LouRockwell.com. There's plenty of great thinkers on there that are far better than I am on it. I'm not an economist. There's also a website called the Mises Institute. You can go to Mises.org. Plenty of just brilliant article after article. Tons of books on there. Mises.org. all kinds of information. You can get the really basic fundamental stuff. You can get commentary on what's going on these days. You can educate yourself on your computer without ever heading to anywhere near a university. And that's a good idea these days. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed the show. Go to my site, ditchthestateloveholychurch.com. Deus Volt. God bless. Cue the music.